Eduardo, we are live. Can you please start?
Good morning. My name is Eduardo Diaz, and it's a pleasure for me to present the first talk of our event. I'm going to ask you to please keep your microphones and cameras off during this plenary, and all the questions you may have can be set on the Q&A section or the chat of the Zoom session, of the Zoom webinar. Okay. Let me introduce you to our plenarist here. She's Dr. Christina Gkonou. Dr. Christina Gkonou is Associate Professor of TESOL and MA TESOL Program Leader in the Department of Language and Linguistics at the University of Essex in the United Kingdom. She's also Deputy Director of Education in the same department. She convenes postgraduate modules on teacher education and development and on psychological aspects surrounding the foreign language learning and teaching experience. She's co-editor of New Directions in Language Learning Psychology with Sarah Mercer and Dietmar Tatzel. New Insights into Language Anxiety, Theory, Research, and Educational Implications with Jean-Marc Dewale and Marc Daubny. And The Emotional Roller Coaster of Language Teaching with, again, Jean-Marc Dewale and Jim King. She's also co-author of MYE, Managing Your Emotions Questionnaire with Rebecca L. Oxford, and has published a number of research articles in international peer-reviewed journals. She's currently co-authoring a book with Kate Burton for Cambridge University Press on the Flourishing School, Cultivating Well-Being for Teachers and Leaders, which will be out in spring 2022. So it's for me an honor, as I've said before, to give the word to our first talk of this morning. Please, Dr. Christina Gkonou.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Eduardo. Thank you for the invitation. I am actually honored to be here, and I was really looking forward to this event. I wish, like everybody else, I guess, for all of us to be together in the same place, be in a face-to-face conference, if you like, this particular format, but that was not possible. But even so, I'm looking forward to all of the opportunities that we will have for interaction during this conference. So I will start by sharing my screen. So just give me a moment to sort out the different screens and the different tabs that I have here. Okay, that's it. And I will also make it full screen because I think it's much better for everybody. Okay, here it is. Right, so today I will focus on emotions and autonomy. I would like to make an attempt to make the link between language learner emotions and language learner autonomy much clearer. And I think this is going to be my main message, the main message of this presentation. I have called the presentation Managing Emotions for Learner Autonomy because I will refer to specific examples from the questionnaire that Eduardo has just mentioned, the one called MYE, Managing Your Emotions for Language Learning Questionnaire, and I will refer to specific examples from this particular instrument and some of the data that, preliminary data that I have collected with a view to making suggestions for how we can improve or increase learner autonomy through successful emotion regulation. I was thinking of how I could divide this presentation into different sections or different parts, and I will be focusing on three main areas. So the first one is psychology and emotions, with a specific focus on language learning psychology, what we already know from language learning psychology about learner emotions. The second part is going to be emotions and autonomy. Are they linked? If yes, how? And why it is important to make sure that the link is increased, that the link is fostered in this particular case. And the last part is where I'm going to talk about emotion regulation for enhanced learner autonomy. I am hoping to show that emotion regulation enhances autonomy, but also that increased learner autonomy helps learners to improve their emotion regulation skills. I want to show you two summaries of language learners. They are fictional characters, so I don't know these people, right? I just made them up. And we have Alessandra on the one side, like the left column, and then we have Eric on the right column on this screen. Now, these language learners have some specific characteristics. They are different. I will read out the characteristics and you will see what I mean. We have Alessandra on the one hand, who is not motivated to learn English because for her, English is a compulsory subject at school. She is an extrovert. She enjoys group work and she's also sociable, she's talkative, she's lax, she's relaxed in class and in social interactions inside the classroom, but also outside of class. Then on the other side, on the other column, we've got Eric, who is a highly motivated student because he is considering opportunities for study abroad. So he's learning English because he wants to improve his English to be able to then be admitted at a university abroad. He is an introvert. He's anxious to succeed. He really wants to do well. And he's self-conscious about his own pronunciation in English. So these are two very brief descriptions, the profiles of these particular learners. And I have a question for you. You can type in the chat if you like, or you can just simply think of the answer to this question. Which learner, Alessandra or Eric, will succeed in English language learning and why? Okay. If we were to pick one, which one would we pick? And if you think that having a forced choice is making your life very difficult, then think of, if you're thinking that it's difficult to tell, for example, then think of why it's difficult to tell. I know that there is something in the chat and I'm trying to open it here, but I can't. I'm not sure why. Oops, sorry. Okay, I am sure that we will come up with similar answers. Some of us will provide similar answers, some others might have a different answer, and our explanations, our answers to the why question might also be different, or there might be some similarities there. But in the next slide, I have listed some of my thoughts. I think that it is rather difficult to predict who will be more successful learner. We cannot safely or confidently say that one will succeed and the other will fail. It is not, I would say it is not an either or question, and we can't say that if a learner has this particular set of characteristics that Alessandra, for example, has, they will definitely be led to success, or they will definitely be led to failure, because language learning is not linear. It's not a linear process. And I would say it is a very complex process because the people that are involved in language learning are complex too. And by complex in this case, I mean that they have lots of traits, they have lots of characteristics, they have different personalities, different psychologies, different backgrounds as well, which really play a role to who these learners are in the present classroom. And that is why, for this particular reason, it is important to adopt or embrace a holistic view of the language learner, and perhaps a holistic view of the psychology of the language learner. And I'll show you now what exactly I mean. So what is language learning psychology, part of which is emotions and part of which is also learner autonomy? According to Mercer, Ryan and Williams, language learning psychology is concerned with the mental experiences, processes, thoughts, feelings, motives, and behaviors of individuals involved in language learning. So in this case, we are interested in how these people feel, how these people think, and how their thoughts and feelings influence their actions or determine their actions. Now, within the field of language learning psychology, I would say that motivation has been the winner somehow, the #1 construct that has attracted most of the attention among researchers. And as Ushioda highlighted, among the psychological constructs implicated in L2 learning, none has perhaps generated as much literature as motivation. And this is very true. And no one can actually contest that motivation is indeed a very important psychological construct and determines language learning to a large extent. But the question is it just about motivation? I would say no. And I have created this table after reading the first edited anthology on language learning psychology by Mercer, Ryan, and Williams that was published back in 2012. I think that was the very first attempt to include within a book, within a single book, the different psychological constructs that play a role in language learning. I actually, in a way, I copied this table from one of the worksheets that I have produced for my postgraduate students here at Essex. I teach a module called Topics in the Psychology of Language Learning and Teaching to MA students. And this includes MA Applied Linguistics and MA TESOL students. And in the introductory lecture, I give them this table and I tell them, okay, you have a look, you have in front of you the list of psychological constructs for which we know things from research. So there is research in second language acquisition within the field of second language acquisition on each of these psychological constructs. Have a look at the list and take a moment to think of whether you know this word, this term, whether you have come across this term but you are not sure what it means, and whether there is any term on this list that you have never heard before, you don't know what it is, you can't guess even. So in a nutshell, you don't know it. And the ones that most of my students actually know are motivation. They can understand identity and they can explain it well to me as well. That's important too. They can guess about anxiety, what foreign language anxiety is, because they draw on their general knowledge of general anxiety. They understand emotions. They understand group dynamics to some extent. They struggle with some of these terms, such as mindsets, for example, or attributions or agency. But what is important for them to understand, and what is important for all of us to understand, is that none of these constructs can stand on its own. It's not possible to actually investigate just one single construct without considering at least some of the others, because many of them play a role in language learning at the same time. I have highlighted in red 2 of those constructs, emotions and learner autonomy, because they are the focus of today's talk. Now, emotions are a topic that has been studied widely in general education and in general psychology. This is where things started. And it has recently started to gain attention in our field. And I have included here a quote from Ledoux, that our minds have thoughts as well as emotions, and the study of either without the other will never be fully satisfying. And I like I have included this image here. I like it very much personally. When I first saw it, I thought it was lovely, because it actually, what we see is like the heart holding hands with our brain, with the brain, and they are walking together towards a specific direction. And that is very true. I think it represents what happens in reality in our everyday lives, that the way we feel influences the way we think and vice versa. There is a very strong link between emotions and cognition, between emotions and thought. In other words, we know from research that the stronger the emotional connections and the more meaningful the information and linkages are, the stronger the memory trace will also be. When something happens and we are emotionally connected with it, we are most likely to retain it in our memory. And I was thinking of the second point, that a great source of anxiety for many people is the loss of memory and information. What will happen when they will start forgetting things, when they will start forgetting information, names, places, and so on. And indeed, this is a great source of anxiety. Now, the current view on emotions is the post-structuralist discursive one. And now, in very simple terms, this actually means that emotions are not seen as individual entities or individual constructs, but they are seen as being influenced by the environment, but by the context that actually surrounds us, by the people that are in this environment, and by the relationships that we have with them. And that is why emotions are largely contextual, relational, and the effects of contact among people, ideas, things, places, objects, and so on. And what is also important to remember is that the same object or the same idea or the same situation might engender different emotions among people. And I think this is very clear in the photo on the right. These are pupils in the same classroom attending the same lesson, and we see that although they are placed in the same class, they are attending the same lesson. In one case, we can probably detect some enthusiasm, some joy, whereas in the other case, perhaps some like boredom, if you like, or perhaps the topic is not that interesting, and therefore the levels of motivation or engagement might be quite low. Now, I want us to have a look at the comments that are on the next screen and think for a moment of whether you have heard these comments. I will give you a minute to read through them on your own and think of whether you have heard these comments and from whom you have heard these comments. Who have you heard saying those? Here they are. So all of these comments come from a questionnaire. It's called the Foreign Language Classroom Anxiety Scale. It includes 33 similar comments, and I just took 5 out of the list just to use them here as examples of things that we have heard our students saying, perhaps things that we might have said or felt when we were learning or while we are currently learning a foreign language, and statements that language teachers, not just English language teachers, there is a strong focus on English here, but I would say that these are statements that language teachers in general might come across, might hear either from themselves, from their students most of the times. And what is interesting in this case is to think of the implications of such comments for language learning, implications for the psychology of the learners that actually say them, and what we can also do as either learners or teachers of a language in order to help ourselves and to help our students as well. These comments are actually comments that highly anxious learners tend to make. And that is why they come from the Foreign Language Classroom Anxiety Scale. They focus on this particular emotion, language anxiety, which reflects the worry and negative emotional reaction when learning and using a second language. Language anxiety is especially relevant in a classroom where self-expression takes place. And I think this is the most important part of this definition, that in cases where self-expression happens, in many cases, this is in the language classroom, but there are also cases where we are outside of the language class and we need to express ourselves. We need to ask a question. We need to ask for directions. We are in a conversation and we need to be able to understand what other people say in order to interact with them. In all of these cases where we need to express ourselves through a language, we tend to get anxious. It is a relatively common emotion. Most of the times negative, I would say, and that is why this is what makes it largely unwelcome, because it can impact negatively on the language learning experience. And the consequences of anxiety have been well documented. I'll show you some in a while. And as I have just said, anxiety is primarily negative and hinders learning, in which case it is debilitative. There is some literature, though, which has actually shown that some anxiety can push people to work in a positive way, because it becomes an incentive for them to work, or a drive, or attention, or an alertness. These are all terms that language anxiety researchers have used to clarify or exemplify the meaning of positive anxiety. What does it mean when anxiety is viewed as a positive thing? In which case it is called facilitated anxiety. The consequences can be many, and they can influence different aspects of one's learning. And I would say that what you see in the table here, can be consequences of other negative, difficult or unpleasant emotions that our learners might experience in class, not just of anxiety. But what I have included here comes from research results, and there are not enough data to come up with conclusions about the consequences of other emotions. But to some extent, we can extend them to some of the other negative emotions. In terms of behavioral or physical consequences, anxiety leads to increased heartbeat, fidgeting, trembling, maintaining less eye contact with the teacher or with our interlocutors. There are linguistic and cognitive consequences as well. High levels of anxiety impact negatively on proficiency and achievement. Highly anxious learners also forget what has been learned. There are emotional consequences as well, in which case our students might feel insecurity, panic, worry, embarrassment. They may procrastinate until they feel that the work they can produce is good or is perfect. And that is why many highly anxious language learners are perfectionists indeed. And the last set of consequences refers to the interactional and social domain, in which case learners tend to participate less, they are silent, they might be hiding somewhere at the back of the class, trying not to be visible to the teacher, and might also limit social exchanges inside and outside of class. And there are, of course, longer term consequences. For example, abandoning one's studies, having totally negative attitudes towards the target language or even the target culture, having low willingness to communicate, perhaps some tensions among learners, and learner doubting themselves, their abilities, their efficacy as a learner, and also a detrimental impact on learners' enthusiasm and motivation. These are all important consequences, and although they are much longer term than what I showed to you in the previous screen, they need to be somehow dealt with because we do not want language learning to be a negative and unpleasant process or experience for our students. So what can we do when our students experience all of these negative emotions? What can we do to help them really? Let's say this area, this set of actions that we can take is called emotion regulation, and it actually includes different strategies, different action that we can take in order to manage an emotion or a set of emotions. Emotion regulation includes a self-awareness of one's own emotions, understanding of how these emotions are experienced and expressed, and also strategies for managing these emotions. And it is activated when emotions are felt to be undesirable. We do not want this particular emotion any longer. We understand that it is bad for us, and we want to take action in order to manage it. And when is it useful? I would say it is useful for many different things, a lot more things than what I have listed here, but I have tried to think of why and when it is useful for classroom language learning. It is useful for self-control, it is useful for more effective learning, it is useful for autonomous learning as well, because I will show some examples in a while of how it can make our learners more autonomous learners. And I would say it is also useful for more effective teaching. I have put this in brackets. The fact that I have put it in brackets doesn't mean it is less important. It's just that I have put it in brackets because our focus is language learners, language learner autonomy, and language learner emotional self-regulation. But clearly, if both learners and teachers in the classroom are good emotion regulators, can manage their emotions well, then the conditions for learning and teaching are going to be further improved. So what we have tried to do with my colleague Rebecca Oxford, who has produced a lot of important work on language learning strategies, is we have tried to think of ways of a better understanding emotion regulation among language learners. Oxford has produced the strategy inventory for language learning, the SEAL, and it has been widely used all over the world in a large number of studies on language learning strategies. And it includes statements that target different types of strategies. For example, cognitive strategies, metacognitive strategies, social strategies, and so on. And one type of such strategies are affective strategies. But if we look at the literature, if we try to evaluate the literature on language learning strategies, and in particular affective strategies, we will see that in most cases where this questionnaire has been used, the students actually say that they don't use affective strategies that much. Or the questionnaire, from a statistical point of view, the questionnaire doesn't load that highly on affective strategies, as is the case with other types of strategies. So we were feeling that affective strategies were neglected. They were not attended to, not as part of data collection tools and measurement tools only, but also in terms of being aware of affective strategies and how important they are for effective language learning. And we thought that we may need a tool that is more narrative focused, that gives people examples of situations, and we see through those hypothetical situations how people react, how students react to those. So we created a scenario-based questionnaire, and I will show you some examples in a while, because we thought that scenarios are well-suited prompts to elicit information from students and from participants more generally. And through scenarios, we can focus on subjective experiences with a particular phenomenon and subjective interpretations of a phenomenon from students. Scenarios represent hypothetical situations, but although they are hypothetical, they are made up somehow, they must always seem possible and recognizable. This is what we felt when we were writing our own scenarios. We wanted them to summarize events, classroom events that students can identify with, things that they can understand. And I'll show you here, I'll give you here some more information about the questionnaire. It includes 20 such scenarios. They are all classroom-based and hypothetical. And we aimed to elicit emotions that students would experience in a particular situation, strategies that they would use to increase a positive emotion and decrease a negative emotion, and data on the implementation and teachability of the effective strategies. And I'll show you now what exactly I mean. I'm using the example of scenario 1. This is the very first scenario on the questionnaire. As you see, it's brief, and all scenarios are of this length. So scenario 1 reads, the teacher assigns an essay writing task in class and allows 60 minutes for completion of the task. After a couple of minutes, you notice that your classmates have already started writing while you still work on the outline of your essay. And indeed, this is something that in my research on language learning anxiety, I have observed quite a lot. This is something that students actually do. Highly anxious students tend to often observe what is happening in the class and what other people are doing. After each scenario, we included the exact same questions, the exact same 8 questions. And I have included those questions here as well, so that you get an idea of what we are asking students to do. Question number 1, what kind of emotions would you experience in this situation, positive or negative? Initially, we were including just positive or negative, and when the questionnaire was used by colleagues in a couple of countries, they said that this forced choice between positive and negative doesn't always work, and we also need a middle option. And this is something that we are now working on changing. Question number 2, please name the emotions, one or more, that you would feel in this situation. And we limit students here to supply a maximum of 10 words. Then question 3 is, what would you do in order to manage these emotions in this situation? What would you do to increase a positive emotion, and what would you do to decrease a negative emotion in this situation? So here we ask students to write a little bit, to produce a little text of maximum 50 words. And then number 4, have you ever encountered this situation or something like it? Yes or no? And then if the answer to 4 is yes, there is one additional question. If your answer to 4 is yes, and if your teacher helped you, circle the appropriate letter below. Either my teacher tried to teach me how to manage my emotions in this situation, and it was successful, or my teacher tried to teach me how to manage my emotions, but it was not successful, or it didn't work for me. Question 6, if your teacher tried to teach you to manage your emotions in this situation, how did he or she teach you to do this? So we were interested in instruction of strategies, and we were interested in the extent to which strategies, and effective strategies in particular, are teachable. Again, a follow-up question to question 4. If the answer to 4 is yes, and if you did not have help from the teacher, what did you do? I consciously tried to manage my emotions in this situation and it was successful. I consciously tried to manage my emotions in this situation, but it was not successful. And I was not conscious enough of my emotions in this situation, so I didn't know what to do really. I couldn't manage my emotions. And the last question was, if you tried to manage your emotions in this situation, how did you do so? And again, we ask students to supply an answer of a maximum of 30 words. So when we first compiled the questionnaire and before we shared it with colleagues who wanted to use it, I used it here in the UK with some of my students, with 43 university students. The majority were female students, Chinese and English L1 speakers, but some other nationalities were also represented. For example, Arabic L1 speakers, Japanese, Thai, Greek, and Spanish. The language classes that these participants were attending were part of their BA degree. And in the case of MA students that took part in the study, the language classes were optional. So they were like an extra set of classes for them. The MYE, Managing Your Emotions questionnaire, was administered in English. And in writing these scenarios, we drew on our own experiences as teachers, and we both have experiences as language learners, and we wanted to bring in those as well. And this is how we made up all of these different stories. I'll show you some of the strategies that students supplied. They are strategies that they used to manage a particular situation and the emotions that they would feel in this particular situation, which basically show how autonomous most of the times these language learners actually were. So scenario 1 is the one that I have just showed to you about the writing task and observing what other people are doing. And some of the strategies that students mentioned where I would try to calm down or relax, concentrate on the task and not look at what others are doing, take a deep breath, some relaxation techniques in this case, self-talk in that a student would think that everyone has their own pace, and appreciation that not all students are the same, the students are different. And the fact that they have started writing after the others doesn't necessarily mean that they are bad students or that they will not be able to complete the task. And other students who said that they would keep working on the outline. There was a nice quote from one of them, which I have put here. I know that I am the person that plans all the things to make sure it is well organized, and then I start to do it. Otherwise, I might feel more anxious when discover something is wrong while writing. I have kept the answers in the original format. I haven't changed them. I haven't done any proofreading. Now, scenario 4, I have selected these scenarios here intentionally because they refer to different aspects of learning. So scenario 4 is the following. You get back your end of term test results. You scored 50% on this test. There are 2 more terms to go until the end of the academic year. And at the end of each term, you will take a similar test again. Now, this is a scenario that produced mixed responses in terms of the emotions that students would feel in this case. Some students would say, some students would experience somewhat positive emotions in that they know they will have the chance to take a similar test again. Some others would experience rather negative emotions because they would really want to do very well at the end of term test, even though 2 similar tests would be coming up later in the year. But the strategies that they suggested were very interesting. So students said that they would study hard for the next 2 tests. They would try to do something that makes them happy to forget about this 50% score and then shift the attention to the following tests. They would try to think positively, convince themselves that it is only 1 test, it's not the end of the world, in other words. They would plan their studies, they would review more often or revise in a different manner to do well in the next 2 tests, and reflect on the reasons for getting a low mark. And the next scenario is scenario 5, which is the following. The teacher arranged one-to-one tutorials with each student in your class. The teacher explains that this will give you and your classmates the opportunity to discuss your concerns and any difficulties you might have with the language and the course material. And I will admit here that when we were writing this scenario, we were consciously intending this scenario to generate positive emotions. And I think this is what happened in the end. The vast majority of students listed positive emotions that they would feel as a response to this particular experience. And now let's have a look at the strategies in this case. The first one, I find it very interesting because the student, for example, said, I feel positive, so there is no need for strategy use, for strategy activation in this case. The second strategy, I don't think this is something I would have to manage. Since it is a positive emotion, I will try to make use of it as often as I can. I would prepare my questions in advance in order to get the most of the tutorial. And I would think of the purpose of the tutorials and then start thinking what I could do to maximize their effectiveness. I find the first couple of answers really interesting because there is a general tendency for, I think, all people, not just language learners, to actually think that if we are experiencing a positive emotion, there is no need to do anything about it. And I would say that to a large extent, this is very true. But when it comes to positive emotions, it is important to also consider their impact and actually think of what the third student actually said, or what the third response actually says here, that since it is a positive emotion, I will try to make use of it as often as I can. So it is important to think that it is a positive emotion, to evaluate it as such, to evaluate it as a positive emotion, but to also think of ways of making use of it at a later stage, especially if we have identified it as an emotion that certainly helps us in what we do. And the last scenario that I picked, scenario 10, is about grammar and error correction. The teacher repeats a grammar rule which certain students in the class found hard to grasp. However, you have understood the rule and such repetition might not be useful for you. Instead, you would prefer some more practice with a grammar point. So here we have a case, a situation in which this particular student has understood the rule and would benefit from something else, something different from what the teacher has actually decided to do. And what would the strategies be in this case for managing the emotions that the students said they would feel? There were interesting responses in this case. That is why I have included more strategies here. I would start drawing doodles to kill time, patience, or I would be patient. I would still listen to the rule and answer the questions the teacher asked because I could feel self-confidence during answering the question correctly. So this particular student basically means that additional explanations are not necessarily that bad. They would still benefit me and they would bring more confidence in what I am doing. And I do the practice with the grammar point myself to ignore the repetition. I would try to think of something very good that I have understood the rule, and I would be respectful to others. I would take advantage of the repetition, a similar strategy. And another interesting one was I would be hesitant to talk with the teacher about this and feel embarrassed to do so. I wouldn't want to expose myself and feel that I was superior to other students, and I would just keep the preferences to myself and wait until the teacher could then move on to the practice, to what the teacher had planned for the whole class. So we can actually see from these strategies that the students supplied that although many of them refer to how the students would manage their emotions, many of them also refer to how they would manage their thinking and their learning. And although all of the scenarios and all of the follow-up questions were written in such a way that they would target emotions, emotion regulation, emotion management, we can see that they also show that students have strategies in their repertoire of strategies. They do have strategies that can actually facilitate their learning, not just how they feel about their learning and about themselves as language learners, but also how they would manage different aspects of their language learning. So what can we conclude from all of this? The first thing, which is basically what I said at the beginning of the talk, is that language learning is not linear and involves complex processes because it includes many different tasks, different people, different situations, different conditions, different materials. And all of these different aspects make language learning a complex process. The psychological constructs are interconnected, and this is something that we see in research that has already been published in the area, that it is very difficult to focus on just one psychological construct. And actually, if we think of classrooms, how real classrooms actually work, we see different psychological constructs being activated at the same time among our students and among ourselves as teachers. Another important point that I have been thinking about a lot, not just as a result of this, of writing this presentation, but more generally, is that emotion regulation makes us more autonomous. And although the focus here is on language learners and language classrooms, I would say that when we know how to regulate our emotions, or even if we are not sure, we are in the process of trying to find ways to regulate our emotions, which means we are thinking about it, we are attending to it, we are becoming more and more independent, not only in terms of how we are going to regulate our emotions, but also in terms of how we are going to approach our learning. And I think that this relationship works the other way around as well, that if our students appreciate autonomy, understand the importance of being autonomous learners and fostering their own autonomy, this will help them to boost their emotion regulation skills. And I think that learners will be more, again, will attend to it, and they will be consciously focusing on ways to regulate their emotions in class and outside of class about their learning. What was interesting in the data that I have was that most participants would not escape an uncomfortable situation, but would instead persist with it and take action to confront it. So they wouldn't say, oh, this is too hard, or this is causing a really challenging, unpleasant set of feelings to me. Therefore, I will just escape this. I will just omit it and do something else. But they would persist with it. So they would take action. They wouldn't flee. In this case, they wouldn't, you might have heard of the fight or flight response in psychology. So in this particular case, the students would stay there and they would persist with it and they would fight instead of just going away. Now, what is the future of all of this? And that is why I have put a question mark here. I really think that we should make the link between emotions and autonomy much clearer. I don't think it is that clear. I don't think that it has been clearly documented somewhere, but there is clearly a very strong link between emotion management and learner autonomy. And in terms of future directions, it is important to train our students. And I know that I am aware that the learner autonomy researchers and practitioners are doing fantastic work in training students to become more autonomous. But I also think it is important to train the teachers too, not just the students, because these two groups, the students and the teachers, are working so closely together pretty much every day throughout the school year, that it is important for both groups to know what they're doing, to appreciate the importance of autonomy and emotion regulation, and to make sure that these are brought together nicely in the language classroom. Because the final note from me is that we want language learning to be an enjoyable and lifelong experience. We do not want our learners to be faced with consequences such as the ones I showed to you earlier when I was talking about anxiety. On the contrary, we want language learning to be a positive experience for them, and we want them to persist with language learning when they are not in our classes any longer. When, for example, they have graduated, we want them to still be interested in learning and improving. That was all from me. I would like to thank you very much for listening. I know that there have been some messages in the chat in the Q&A. I wasn't able to open them, but I think that once I stop sharing my screen, I should be able to check all the chat boxes. My email address is here as well, so please feel free to get in touch via email or connect on social media to continue with the discussions on autonomy and emotions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gkonou. Yes, so we're going to start checking on the questions our audience has for you.
Thank you. Is it okay if I stop sharing my screen? Ah, you've done it for me. Thank you.
Right. So we're going to start with a question by Norma Garcia. She asks, how do you think restrictions or the lack of on L2 usage in the classroom affect emotions and motivations?
Say that again. How?
How do you think the restrictions on L2 or the lack of restrictions on L2 in the classroom affect emotions and motivations?
Okay, good question. And I think I would probably start by considering what these restrictions are. There might be different types of restrictions, like different, if by restrictions you mean challenges that our students make, I would say that different students will be faced with different challenges, or they might be having different restrictions, in which case we might need to think a little bit more individually, if you like. And by this, I mean thinking in terms of individual students in our classes rather than our group of students collectively, to actually think of what these restrictions are, what challenges do our students face. And once we identify those, once we are clearer about those, we might be able to then understand why they impact on motivation or engagement and what we can do about that. But I would say I would start with the heart of the problem, like what the problem is, what's causing it. There are so many instances of students being faced with challenges in class that have actually nothing to do with the class. They have to do with a set of other challenges that they might be faced with. But then in the classroom, their motivation and engagement are negatively influenced. So I would probably start with that. If you mean something else by restrictions, let us know, and we will come back to this question.
Thank you for your answer. The next question is asked by Gabriela Casillas, and it is, would the answers to the MYE differ in this instrument? Would the answers to the MYE differ if this instrument had been administered in the participants' L1?
Right, good question. Yes, I use it here in English because I work with multilingual and multicultural classes. So English is the language that we all share. So I'm able to explain to the students what the questionnaire is about, and I'm able to understand their answers because they write them in English. I know that the questionnaire has already been used in 3 countries so far, I mean outside of the UK. These are Poland, Japan, and Greece. There are publications from our colleagues in Poland and Japan. The ones from Greece have not been published yet, but I know that colleagues were very keen to translate them into the students' L1. And I have also read the translation in Greek because this is a language I speak and I can understand it. And I think that, yes, some of the answers would change because there are instances where people tend to feel more comfortable to talk about emotions if it is in a language that they are also more comfortable with. It would be interesting in this case to actually administer the questionnaire in English, administer the questionnaire to the same participants, but have 2 versions, one in English, one the participants L1, and see what answers they might come up with. But if you are interested in the language of emotion, if we can put it this way, there is interesting research by Jean-Marc Dewalle, by Aneta Pavlenko, who actually talk about the expression of emotions among multilinguals and whether they have preferred languages in which they can use to talk about their emotions. And I think that, yes, it will make some difference with relation to some of the scenarios or with relation to some of the questions.
Thank you. We have another question. This is Ana Luisa Castillos, and she asks something that is actually something we face a lot here in our country. How do you handle handle a mixed class with different levels. It's a big challenge since some students may get bored while others don't quite get the point.
Yes, this is a very good question. And I believe it is something we had also to some extent thought about when we wrote scenario, I think it was scenario 10 that I showed to you earlier, like the teacher wants to provide more explanations for the students that haven't understood, that are still unclear about the grammar rule. And there is one student or a couple of students in that class who have understood it and they would rather move on to the activity. They don't want to listen to more explanations. And I think this is a very good description of a mixed ability class, which is what your question is about. And mixed ability classes are really challenging for teachers, I would say, because it's difficult for teachers to work with students of mixed abilities, of mixed levels at the same time. And as you have said, it is also difficult for students because students in a mixed ability class might experience very different emotions. Some of them might be bored because they can't move on, because there are some other students in the class that are slower. And some other students might feel anxious because they might feel that they cannot keep up with the pace. So we might have totally different emotional responses or reactions to what is happening in class. And I think from the teacher's point of view, trying to understand what the differences between students, what the differences among students actually are, makes a big difference. It can help teachers to understand who the students are, what they can do well, what they cannot do so well, and how the teacher can actually reconcile in the same classroom all these different abilities. And differentiated instruction would be one answer, one possible answer to this question. And also preparing different materials for the students. And by this, I mean having some extra materials to give, some extra activities perhaps, to give to the students that complete the task quickly, and then they sit there and have nothing to do. So in order to prevent them from getting bored, you can probably do something like that. Differentiated instruction, however, is quite hard to achieve when we are teaching large classes. When we are dealing with, let's say, classes of at least 40 or 50 students, and there are contexts around the world with classes of 120, 150. So in this case, it's going to be really hard. But any chances we might have to understand our students as much as possible, understand how they feel, what they can do well, and so on, I think we should really take advantage of those as teachers.
Thank you. We've got it's a question by Cecilia Rodriguez. It says, under these circumstances we're living these days, how can we teach or help the students to regulate their emotions? I mean, virtually speaking.
Yeah. Okay, that is another very good question, because I think the pandemic has exacerbated the stress and the emotional states of both learners and teachers, especially when it was still at the beginning, like in March 2020, and for the first few months after March 2020, when we were all not so sure about what is happening, where things will be led to, and so on. I would say that online learning and online teaching has increased the stress of learners and teachers for different reasons. And although it is a different environment, it's online as opposed to face-to-face, the challenges are still there. So the challenges in terms of abilities, strengths, and weaknesses are going to be the same, but with online learning and teaching, they are probably going to be even more or even stronger. And this makes it more difficult for us to overcome them. I would say that I would personally encourage teachers to use similar strategies as the ones we would use in a face-to-face environment. On Zoom or in an online platform, I know that we are deprived of the interaction with real people, but there are things that we can do online to be close to our students, to talk to them, to understand what their concerns are, and try to help them to find a solution. And I would say more one-to-one support, if this is part of our support hours, academic support hours, one-to-one support with our students would certainly help. And I think it's not problem at all to ask students what their stresses are, what their anxieties are in this particular context, as part of the online environment, I mean, and what kind of help they would like to receive. When I was collecting data for this particular questionnaire, the scenario-based questionnaire, we had a wrap-up scenario at the end of the questionnaire. I can't remember exactly the wording, but I will summarize it for you. And the wrap-up scenario was your teacher in the classroom initiates a group discussion about emotions. Would you be willing to take part in this discussion? Yes or no? Why not? And it was interesting from the data that I had that most of the students would be willing to engage in such a discussion. And I think that students really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about how they feel, especially when they come to understand that other people in the class feel the same way as them. So I would like to encourage learners and teachers to be more open about their emotions, to talk about them, and try to together to find a solution.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question.
Okay.
And that would be a question asked by Heidi Diaz. This is a question from the YouTube channel. And she asks, in your experience, who managed more easily their emotions, male students or female students?
Okay. Thank you for this question. I don't have data that can help me to give a concrete answer to this question, because I have not compared across genders. I have not compared the answers that students gave across genders. This is what I mean. I think we shouldn't go down that path, to be honest, because although there might be differences in how male and female students might experience, express, and regulate emotions, I think it is important to work with our learners without thinking of what their gender is. I would mostly focus on their backgrounds rather than their age or differences in age, their gender. I would most likely, focus on how long they have been learning a language, in what settings, whether they have been in classroom settings before, whether it was one-to-one, what experiences they are having now, or what experiences they have had in the past with using the language with other people. All of this. I would mostly focus on that rather than some of the demographic characteristics that might make our students different from each other.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gkonou. On behalf of the Keynote and Ila, we thank you your participation in this plenary session and sharing with us this interesting results of your research, which I bet is going to help us a lot in our daily basis procedures and performance as educators. Let me remind the audience that we still have a lot of talks that you're going to enjoy for sure, and that we have prepared for you a space for networking, or ILA Cafe, where you can share and experience more of these interesting topics of our program with some peers from different parts of the world. So thank you again, Dr. Gkonou, and thank you, your audience, for being here today with us. So we'll continue with our program, and we hope to see you in more of our talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Entre otros anuncios, tenemos también la oportunidad de un ILA Café, pero va a ser con the Japanese Association of Self-Access Language Learning, va a ser informal. Será en la plataforma Wonder, estaremos compartiendo esta información a través de las diferentes redes y será el miércoles 30 a las 7 de la mañana, tiempo de México. Estaremos compartiendo, les agradecemos, será una oportunidad para compartir con los miembros de JASAL en esta conferencia. Please, I remind you, we have a new announcement. We are going to have an ILA Café networking with JASAL Association. It's going to be in Wonder, and we will be sharing soon the link through your mails and in the different sessions we're having. Thank you for your attention.